Good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me. Today, not as much of a reluctant prophet as I usually am. This is my magnum opus. I really enjoyed doing the research for this and writing it, and I hope you're going to enjoy it as well. The adage, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, is only partially accurate. It would be more correct to state that those who are unaware of history cannot avoid making history's mistakes if they are not aware of what mistakes have been made. I suppose in an age when the entire cosmic library of human knowledge is accessible through our smartphones, we ought to be more aware, more cautious, and more unwilling to repeat humanity's greatest failures. But alas, that is not the case. I would wager few of you reading this or hearing me have ever spent time researching the vast scope of knowledge that has been digitized and made accessible through apps such as Bing AI. So today we will change topics, switch lanes, and move on to examine how, what, why, when, and where the West got into bed with communist China so that American industrialists could access China's cheap labor pool. I came upon a meme yesterday on a social media group of a photograph of America's past presidents up to the Obama administration, which included the two Bushes, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter, standing with Obama, which bore the text, "This is why all your stuff comes from China," to which I added when sharing it to my own profile, "Never forget, this is the legacy of Kissinger and Nixon, who when creating détente with communist China, opened China's cheap labor market to American industrialists, thereby making a pact with the devil. The outcome of this détente is proof America wasn't really fighting communism in Vietnam, since it was China who had funded the Viet Cong. Rather, Kissinger and Nixon ended up helping to fund communism by handing over our supply chain to our ideological enemies, allowing the communist Chinese to profit from Western capitalism. Today, I hope to unpack these ideas, to examine the timeline of the Vietnam War, the American public's reaction to the conflict. Moreover, the real strategy of those who were pulling the strings behind the scenes, which led to untold loss of human life and a stain on the reputation of America pursuing just and winnable conflicts, which is a problem that has plagued America's military ever since. More importantly, how we became dependent on our enemies to supply the West with cheap goods of poor quality. And worse, how we got into bed with multinational conglomerates in the pharmaceutical industries to fund them to use Chinese laboratories under the control of the CCP to create bioweapons and mRNA messenger inoculations that were tainted with human DNA. Let's begin with an estimate from Bing AI as to the Vietnam War's cost in human life. Estimates of the total number of deaths during the Vietnam War vary widely due to the different time periods covered by the studies and whether casualties in Cambodia and Laos were included in the estimates. Here are some estimates. A 1975 U.S. Senate subcommittee estimated around 1.4 million civilian casualties in South Vietnam because of the war, which included 415,000 deaths. An estimate by the Department of Defense after the war gave a figure of 1.2 million civilian casualties, including 195,000 deaths. Gunter Louis in 1978 estimated 1,353,000 total deaths in North and South Vietnam during the period between 1965 and 1974. A 1995 demographic study in Population and Development Review calculated 791,000 to 1,141,000 war-related Vietnamese deaths, both soldiers and civilians, for all of Vietnam from 1965 to 1975. In 1995, Vietnam released its official estimate of the number of people killed during the Vietnam War, which is as many as 2 million civilians on both sides, and some 1,100,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. Next subtitle: How and why did America become involved? The U.S. involvement in Vietnam began due to a number of factors, and here we will list them. The domino theory. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the American foreign policy establishment tended to view the situation in Southeast Asia in terms of the domino theory. The basic principle was that if French Indochina, Vietnam was still a French colony, fell to the communist insurgency, the expansion of communism throughout Asia would be likely to continue unchecked. Anti-communist fervor. On the home front, beginning in 1949, fear of domestic communists gripped America. The country spent much of the 1950s under the influence of the Red Scare, led by the virulently anti-communist Senator Joseph McCarthy. Support to Viet Minh. Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong's pledge in 1950 to support the Viet Minh guerrilla forces in the First Indochina War against French colonials' rule. U.S. war with Japan in the Pacific. The U.S. war with Japan in the Pacific also played a role in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. These factors led the U.S. sending its first military advisors to help the French battle the communists of northern Vietnam in 1950. The U.S. involvement escalated over time, with President Lyndon Johnson dramatically escalating U.S. involvement in the conflict, authorizing a series of intense bombing campaigns and committing hundreds of thousands of U.S. ground troops to the fight. McCarthy's mistake. He ignored a problem hidden in plain sight, the source of today's neo-Marxist indoctrination. Senator Joseph McCarthy is known for his campaign against alleged communists in the U.S. government and other institutions during the early 1950s, a period known as the Red Scare. He alleged that numerous communists and Soviet spies and sympathizers had infiltrated the United States federal government, universities, film industry, and elsewhere. However, it is important to note that while McCarthy made broad accusations, his focus was primarily on the U.S. government, particularly the State Department and the Army. Next subtitle. There could be several reasons why McCarthy did not specifically target universities to the same extent. Focus on the government. McCarthy's primary focus was rooting out alleged communists within the U.S. government. He believed that these individuals posed a direct threat to national security. Public perception. Universities might not have been seen as influential or dangerous as the government or the military. Therefore, McCarthy might have chosen to focus his efforts where he believed they would have the most impact. Tactics and strategy. McCarthy's tactics involved making broad, sweeping accusations without substantial proof. It's possible that he felt this approach would be less effective in the academic world. Ideological indoctrination into belief systems is most effective when it targets youth, since they are the most impressionable and moldable. The anti-war movement of the 60s had many justifiable reasons for opposing the war. However, these reasons became the tools which were exploited by neo-Marxist agitators, many of whom were university professors. Radicals like Saul Alinsky coined the phrase, "The real action is your target's reaction." That's important to remember. Many future high-ranking American politicians, including Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, were heavily influenced by Alinsky. Although Barack Obama was not a direct disciple of Saul Alinsky, he was influenced by Alinsky's ideas. In the mid-1980s, Obama worked for the Developing Communities Project, a group from Chicago's South Side, whose techniques were inspired by Alinsky. He received a comprehensive course in Saul Alinsky during his years as a community organizer in Chicago, an experience Obama recalled as the best education he ever had. By ignoring the academy, McCarthy disregarded the real source for the neo-Marxist ideological possession that has laid hold of the American woke left today. Next subtitle, China's involvement in Vietnam. China provided significant support to the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, which included military aid. China provided extensive logistical training and material aid to North Vietnam, which supported the Viet Cong. Advisors and training. In April 1950, the Viet Minh formally requested military aid, including equipment, advisors, and training. The People's Republic of China began to send their advisors and later formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group to assist the Viet Minh. Financial support. During Ho Chi Minh's official visit to China in 1955, Beijing agreed to provide a grant of $200 million to be used to build various projects. It's important to note that the support was not just financial but also included military and strategic assistance. The Chinese government saw their involvement in the Vietnam War as part of a larger geopolitical strategy and an international obligation. Next subtitle, The Turning Point, the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a major escalation and one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War, launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces against the South Vietnamese and their American allies in January of 1968. The Americans and their Vietnamese allies fought back and repelled most of the attacks. However, the offensive had a significant psychological impact on the American public and the media, as it exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces and the strength and determination of the enemy. The Tet Offensive also eroded the credibility of President Lyndon B. Johnson and General William Westmoreland, who had previously claimed that the war was going well and that victory was near. The offensive sparked a wave of anti-war protests and demonstrations in the U.S., and increased the pressure on Johnson to seek a negotiated settlement. Next subtitle, The Aftermath of the Tet Offensive. According to some sources, the South Vietnamese planned to counterattack after the Tet Offensive, but they were not stopped by the U.S. That's the official story, at least. However, I worked with a Vietnamese intelligence officer who was a captain in the South Vietnamese Army forces. He told me that the Americans threatened them if they were to launch a major counteroffensive into the north. In any case, the South faced strong resistance from the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, who continued to fight in some areas for weeks or months after the initial offensive. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, the South Vietnamese did receive support from their allies, such as the U.S., Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Thailand, who helped them repel the attacks and regain control of the cities and towns that had been captured by the enemy. So the Tet Offensive, despite being a military defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, had a significant political and psychological impact on the U.S. and South Vietnamese. It exposed the gap between the optimistic claims of the U.S. military and the harsh realities of war. And it eroded the public support and confidence in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which is why the Tet Offensive is widely considered as a turning point in the Vietnam War, as it marked the beginning of the slow and painful American withdrawal from the region. Next subtitle, Kissinger, the greatest of all Besserwissers. The Vietnam War had started on November the 1st, 1955, while the Paris Peace Accords marked the beginning of the end of the war. They were signed on January the 27th, 1973. Therefore, the war had been going on for a little over 17 years before the accords were arranged. Henry Kissinger, who served as National Security Advisor and later as Secretary of State under President Richard Nixon, played a significant role in both escalating and ending the Vietnam War. Number one, escalation of war. Kissinger controversially hid the 1969 bombings of Cambodia and Laos from Congress, which escalated the Vietnam War. 2. Secret negotiations. Nixon granted Kissinger permission to conduct secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese. These negotiations were part of Nixon's strategy to end the war and bring peace with honor. 3. The Paris Peace Accords. After years of talks with the North Vietnamese, Kissinger negotiated the Paris Peace Accord of 1973. These accords led to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American troops. 4. Nobel Prize. Despite the controversy surrounding his role in the war, Kissinger won the Nobel Prize for negotiating the Paris Peace Accords. Kissinger's role in the Vietnam War was complex, multifaceted, and certainly contradictory, which is why his actions during this period continue to be a subject of much debate. Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to China in 1971. This trip was a significant diplomatic breakthrough that paved the way for Nixon's historic visit to China the following year. During his secret trip, Kissinger feigned illness while at a meeting in Pakistan and flew undercover to Beijing for these unprecedented talks. The talks led to an agreement that President Nixon would visit China in February of 1972, marking the first time a U.S. president had visited the People's Republic of China. Nixon's visit was a seminal step in normalizing relationships between the two countries whose forces were still engaged in military conflict in Southeast Asia. Kissinger's secret trip and the subsequent visit by Nixon were part of a strategic shift in U.S. foreign policy, which sought to leverage China as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This approach was known as triangular diplomacy and was a key aspect of Nixon and Kissinger's foreign policy strategy. During Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China in 1971, he discussed the Vietnam War with Premier Zhou Enlai. Kissinger pressed Zhou to end the supply of arms to North Vietnam. However, the talks did not lead to any immediate breakthroughs. Zhou told Kissinger that North Vietnam was playing off China against the Soviet Union, and to cut off North Vietnam would allow it to fall under Soviet influence. Despite these discussions, the Chinese did not help Nixon end the war at that time. As I mentioned, these talks were part of a broader strategy to improve U.S.-China relations and to leverage China as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Next subtitle, The End of the U.S. Involvement in Vietnam and the Ultimate End of the Conflict with North Vietnam, resulting in annexing the South under centralized communist control. The end of the Vietnam War was precipitated by several key events and factors. Number one, the Paris Peace Accords. The Paris Peace Accords signed on January the 27th, 1973, marked the beginning of the end of the war. These accords led to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American troops. 2. Vietnamization. This was a policy of the Nixon administration to end U.S. involvement in the war by transferring all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. 3. Public opinion. The American public's growing opposition to the war, particularly after the Tet Offensive, put pressure on the U.S. government to seek an end to the conflict. 4. Congressional action. The U.S. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which limited the president's ability to conduct war without congressional approval. 5. The fall of Saigon. The fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese forces on April the 30th, 1975, marked the end of the war. Next subtitle. The significance of the what is the significance of the role did Kissinger and Nixon play in opening communist China to American businessmen? Here are some key points. Number 1, secret diplomacy. Kissinger, as Nixon's national security advisor, made a secret trip to China in 1971, as I mentioned, paving the way for Nixon's historic visit the next year. 2, normalizing of relations. Nixon's visit in 1972 marked the first time a U.S. president had visited the People's Republic. The visit was an important step in normalizing relations. 3, geopolitical strategy. The opening of China was part of a broader geopolitical strategy known as triangular diplomacy, as I mentioned, that sought to leverage China as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union. 4, economic opportunities. Now here we go. The normalization of relations between the U.S. and China opened new economic opportunities for American businesses. In other words, new economic opportunities which funded communism and betrayed the American worker. It is important to note that while Nixon and Kissinger played crucial roles in opening China, the process of fully integrating communist China into the global economy took many years and involved the efforts of many other traders, individuals and institutions. Next subtitle, How America Helped to Fund a Global Pandemic to Assist in Fulfilling Communism's Ultimate Goal, to Collapse Free Market Capitalism. The U.S. government, specifically the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, provided funding to several research institutions, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology of China. This funding was part of a grant to EcoHealth Alliance, a global environmental health nonprofit organization. The grant, worth $2,168,345, was used between 2014 and 2021 for various research purposes, including risky gain-of-function experiments with coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Remember, this information is coming from Bing AI, and that's been programmed by pretty left-leaning people. Even they are willing to talk about this. It's important to note that the funding was not solely for the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and not all the funding took place under one administration. For instance, approximately $700,000 of the total grant was approved under the Trump administration. So much for Trump, keeping China at bay. The purpose of this funding was to support research into bat coronaviruses, which was considered important for preventing and preparing for potential future pandemics. However, the funding and the research it supported have been the subject of controversy and investigation, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has significantly disrupted global supply chains, including those between the West and China. Here are some key challenges. Number 1, manufacturing disruptions. The pandemic led to scheduled closures of manufacturing and distribution facilities, creating bottlenecks in supply lines. This was particularly impactful in China, a major global manufacturing hub. Now, in 2009, I flew into Shanghai, and from Shanghai, we went out to Chengdu and drove north to Diyang, which is the area where the earthquake hit several years ago, and we visited factories there. Then we flew back east to Hefei, where we are invited into the Communist Party's Economic Development Headquarters, and our mayor, Brian McMillan, was with us at the time. And then from there, we took a high-speed train to Wuxi, where we visited other facilities, then drove back to Shanghai to fly home and met with businessmen there prior to flying out. Their factories are absolute shitholes. They have no quality. Workers have no safety. And I couldn't tell the difference between the CCP and the triads. So it's a completely corrupt environment. However, their rotating meals, delicious. And the people I met were very nice. Transportation issues are number 2. There were also disruptions in transportation with record numbers of shipping containers lost at sea. Geez, I wonder where they went. 3, increased demand. Changes in consumer behavior led to irregular demand for certain products, further straining supply chains. 4, reliance on single sources. Many companies found they were overly reliant on single sources, like China, for their supplies. When Chinese factories closed in early 2020, manufacturers struggled to switch to other suppliers. And geopolitical tensions. The U.S.-China trade war and China's zero-COVID restrictions have added to the complexities of recovering global supply chains. So recovering and restructuring these supply chains post-COVID is a complex task. Companies are being advised to make their networks more resilient by diversifying suppliers, stocking essential materials, and exploring production process improvements. Some are considering other manufacturing hubs such as Vietnam, Mexico, and India. However, the difficulty of extricating ourselves from CCP-led China is a process which could last for decades. The invisible hand of God, as opposed to the totalizing enterprise of central planners. The invisible hand metaphor was introduced by the 18th century Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith. The phrase characterizes the instruments through which advantageous social and economic effects arise from the compounded, self-interested practices of individuals whose intents weren't to bring about such outcomes. The notion of the invisible hand has been employed in economics and other social sciences to explain the division of labor, the emergence of a medium of exchange, the growth of wealth, the patterns, such as price levels, manifest in market competition, and the institutions and rules of society. Most importantly, it has been used to argue that free markets, made up of economic agents who act in their own self-interest, deliver the best possible social and economic outcomes. Smith used the phrase on 2 occasions to exemplify how society benefits from the combined interactions of individuals who had no intention to bring about such a good. In Part 4, Chapter 1 of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published 1759, Smith explains that as wealthy individuals, in pursuing their own interests in turn, employ others to labor for them. In this, they are led by an invisible hand. In Book 4, Chapter 2 of An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published 1776, Smith argued against import restrictions and explained how individuals prefer domestic over foreign investments. Smith uses the phrase to summarize how self-interested actions are coordinated in such a way that they advance public interests. In these 2 instances, he revealed a complex and beneficial structure which he explained by invoking basic principles of human nature and economic interaction. Next subtitle: God is the invisible hand, and Jesus Christ is the mighty right hand of God. In all cases of central planning, in all instances of diplomacy where our ideological enemies are pitted against one another, in the totalizing monetary operations of the global banking industry, in the monopolizing multinational conglomerates which operate as though they are above the law, and within the global humanitarian organizations who manipulate humanity like pieces on a chessboard, we see one thing which is undeniably true. Those who engage in such activities have placed themselves in a godlike position. They claim to have knowledge and control over humanity that is anti-human to its very core. These people are narcissistically delusional in terms of their ideological pathology. They ascribe to themselves almost godlike powers. They play humanity as pieces in a global game of monopoly, since they falsely believe that the world God gave us is incapable of sustaining his creation, which is why they constantly use the word sustainable to describe their totalizing enterprise. In this episode, I have clearly demonstrated their actions have resulted in untold loss of human life, pandemics, transference of wealth to the uber wealthy, misappropriation of public funds, damage to the rule of law and the sovereignty of nation states, as well as an emerging form of oppression that is kid glove Marxism, all because these besserwissers cannot believe in the invisible hand of God. The only possible totalizing enterprise is that of God, for in him there is no want, there is no lacking, nor is there any insufficiency. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and since he exists beyond time and is the creator of all things, it is in him that we move and live and have our being. Second, Philippians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men. 8. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient even unto death, yea, the death of the cross. My final thoughts. So you can see the dangers of attempting to play God. Kissinger both acerbated the Vietnam War when he bombed Cambodia and Laos, then made a deal with the very devil he had pitted himself against to destroy, only to get in bed with that very devil to allow our enemies to unleash a plague upon the world. For this, mankind, in his own hubristic nature, gave a Nobel Peace Prize for Kissinger arranging the Paris Accord, a prize that was founded by Alfred Nobel, a Swedish chemist, inventor, engineer, and businessman, who besides being known for the Nobel Peace Prize, is best known for inventing dynamite. Nobel had bequeathed his fortune to establish the Nobel Prize as a fortune that was made by blowing people into smithereens. Was the Nobel Prize for peace? Was the Nobel a prize for peace, or the pieces into which Nobel's dynamite blew his fellow man? See that? There's a play on words. Was the Nobel Prize a prize for peace, or the pieces into which Nobel's dynamite blew his fellow man? The utter insanity of thinking that we can play God and not pay for that satanic ideation. Idea pathogens that attempt to replace God with man can only result in creating hell on earth. Remember, brothers and sisters, that Jesus defeated the enemy of our souls as the Son of Man, not as the Son of God. He was the only perfect man. Man cannot create his own value structure capable of bringing justice and peace to this present age. Nobel Prize, my hairy hiney. We are fallen creatures full of ourselves and full of narcissistic, satanic delusions. Empty yourselves of pride and vanity and come to Christ. There can be no peace or salvation without the Prince of Peace. These are things to think and pray about. Now you've heard my magnum opus. I hope you enjoyed it, and God bless you this afternoon on this February the 6th. Have a lovely afternoon.